What's the most disturbing thing you've overheard that you were never meant to hear? Before we start, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Story 1. Most days, my mom would have her friend over, and they'd spend hours chatting in the kitchen. Her friend, who had recently gone through a divorce, often talked about the guy she was seeing. The dining room table where they sat was directly beneath my bedroom, so I would always turn up my stereo or TV to drown out their conversations. One day, while I was doing homework, I could hear them talking. Mom's friend had a daughter, and she was expressing frustration about her daughter's large breasts, saying she received a lot of attention and that it bothered her when all the boys looked at her instead of her. The friend then revealed that she had been crushing up various diet pills and mixing them into her daughter's food in an attempt to stop her from growing and possibly make them smaller. What is the frustration about? Is she jealous of her daughter? And why is she seeking attention from younger boys in the first place? I can't imagine what else she might have been doing to her. Unbelievable. Quite a disturbing story to start with. Story 2. I overheard my mom talking to her sister after my granddad died. They were talking about how they were shocked on experiencing grief, despite him essaying all 5 girls in the family, starting from toddlers to teen years. That was my first experience of being completely blindsided. We have a large, wholesome family, and we all looked up to our grandparents as good people, seeing their long marriage as a model for relationships. I honestly felt disgusted and angry with my grandmother. I couldn't understand how she didn't know. Story 3. I overheard upper management discussing their conquests in the office, strippers, and who was next on their list. They completely forgot I worked just on the other side of the wall until I walked around to ask them something. I pretended I hadn't heard anything, but their faces went pale when they saw me. I planned to keep it to myself, but I guess they got scared, and not long after that, I was let go. Story 4. Not something I overheard, but something I actually read in a file about me. After my mother passed away unexpectedly, my father gave me a file she had meant to share. It contained a psychological profile, personality tests, and other assessments. This wasn't a surprise to me, as I'm autistic and had been in therapy since childhood. However, there was a section about my family and the challenges they faced living with me. My dad and brothers were struggling to cope, and it was hard for them to understand how my condition affected them. My parents' divorce was largely attributed to me, and my brothers felt embarrassed by my presence. Despite this, I'm doing better than expected. I wasn't supposed to live independently. There were discussions about assisted living or even an institution, but somehow I managed to leave home right after turning 18. I got married, had kids, and even though I face many challenges, I get by. I've also developed a good relationship with my brothers, even though they still find it difficult to see me as an adult. It's like always feeling that everyone knows something about you that you don't, and then discovering it's true. Story 5. When I was about 10, I was spending the weekend with my grandparents. One night, I woke up and heard my grandma's voice coming from the kitchen. Curious, I crept down the hall, thinking she might be making a midnight snack and I could join her. But as I got closer, I realized she was crying. I hid around the corner and listened as she spoke to my grandpa, her voice trembling as she said, "I'm so tired, I just don't know how much longer I can do this." She talked about having to choose each month between buying her medication and putting enough food on the table, and how terrified she was that she might leave us with nothing. She whispered, "They don't even know we're barely holding on." I had no idea what she was going through, and hearing her so scared and vulnerable shattered something inside me. I always viewed her as a strong, unshakable figure, but that night I understood the heavy burden she had been carrying alone and how much she had hidden from me to keep my world feeling safe. To this day, I remember the sound of her voice and the helplessness I felt. I think a part of me grew up in that moment, realizing that sometimes the people we rely on are the ones who need someone to lean on the most. Story 6. I used to be a youth pastor and overheard a parent of one of my youth talking to a coworker about my weight. They criticized me for being overweight and claimed I didn't care about my health, saying I was setting a terrible example for the kids. The parent went so far as to say I'd be dead by 30. I'm 27. She revealed that the only reason she joined the staff parish relations committee was to get me fired for my weight. She admitted to manipulating the pastor to get elected, just so she could pressure me into signing a contract that would lead to my dismissal if I didn't lose weight. Needless to say, I eventually left that job on my own. Story 7. I was representing a client in a family law case when the judge started suggesting he might award some vacant land to the ex-wife. Both the husband and wife were unusually wealthy drug users, and I suspected they had connections to organized crime. During the lunch break, I walked up behind my client in a smoking area and overheard him on the phone saying he was about to lose the farm and that someone needed to get out there tonight to start digging and move everything. At the time, I was pretty naive and thought he was referring to a marijuana growing operation. It wasn't until several years later that I realized they were probably talking about dead bodies. Story 8. I was at the laundromat with my mom and one of her close friends, playing with the machines while they chatted and waited for the laundry to finish. They didn't realize I was just around the corner, listening to their conversation as I played. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. It was just one of those situations where they were within earshot. My mom began to share how, when she told my grandparents that she was pregnant with a black man's baby, they offered to pay for an abortion. They tried to convince her, but thankfully she didn't go through with it. I was her first and only daughter. My grandpa has since passed away, but he always said I was his favorite grandchild. My grandma, who is still alive and well, loves me dearly, and I love them both very much. I'm really glad they changed their mindset after meeting me. Story 9. I remember my mother drunkenly telling some family friends that she regretted having me, claiming she must have done something wrong during her pregnancy because of my congenital issues. I overheard this because I had tiptoed out of my room and into the hallway. It was late, and I was supposed to be in bed, but my little brothers had crawled into my bed because the adults were being loud. They asked me to see if I could get the adults to quiet down, and I felt I had to be a good big sister. I didn't make it that far. When the adults started laughing again, I snuck back into bed. I was only 8, and I don't think I'll ever forget it or forgive her, honestly. Story 10. Last year, while I was returning home from a work trip and about an hour away from boarding my flight, I heard a woman sitting behind me answer her phone. When she received the news that her son had died, her heart-wrenching wail was the saddest sound I've ever heard. It felt surreal to realize that so many of us were witnesses to such a profoundly tragic moment in her life. Story 11. I was at a dance club in Mexico once and headed to the bathroom. There was a crowd at the entrance, and everyone seemed to be engaged in a hushed conversation. I don't speak Spanish. Assuming it was just a line, I joined the group. A local guy came up behind me and tapped my shoulder after a few minutes. We had this exchange. Do you speak Spanish? Me lo siento, no. English. These guys are planning to end someone and think you're listening. You should leave right now. It was a pretty terrifying moment. I thanked the guy and quickly walked back to my friends, deciding to play the part of a clueless American tourist by speaking loudly and obviously in English. As I moved away, I heard him start talking to one of the guys in the group, probably saying something like, "That gringo doesn't know anything." A few minutes later, the group left the club without even glancing my way, and I finally got to use the bathroom, which was a relief. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible happened right after that, which was definitely not a good thought. Story 12. While I was in the ER for kidney stones, I overheard a man next door wailing because his father had suffered a heart attack during a baseball game they were attending. He kept repeating, "We were at the ball game, just having a good time. We were just having a good time." For a brief moment, I didn't feel pain in my kidney. Story 13. My father, who had mostly been absent from my life, was killed by a train when I was 11, just the Saturday before Father's Day. The next day, I overheard my grandmother, his mother, on the phone, telling someone that deputies had walked along the tracks collecting what remained of him in 2 body bags. Story 14. My father-in-law died after a routine hip replacement when his oxygen levels dropped and he suffered heart failure. While he was brain dead in the ICU, a physician came to do his rounds with a group of residents and asked us to step out of the room. We waited in the area outside the elevators, and when the group came out, the doctor told his students, "And that is why you never give Haldol to a heart patient." This ultimately led to my mother-in-law receiving a $150,000 settlement from the hospital. It's also why there are those signs in hospital elevators reminding staff not to discuss patients. It's hard to believe they only settled for $150,000 after such a tragic mistake that cost a life. Thank goodness they were careless enough to say it out loud. Otherwise, they might have gotten away with it completely. It's infuriating. Story 15. My great-grandmother, Delirious on her deathbed, was either talking to herself or to a ghost. It's hard to say. She kept repeating that she was sorry for not protecting someone. She reminisced about her only baby daughter, who would bang her crib against the wall until one day my great-grandfather, in a drunken rage, slammed her against it. When my great-grandmother went to check on her, the baby was limp. She died 18 hours later, and my great-grandfather buried her in the backyard. Edit to add, my great-grandfather was a terrible man who remained an alcoholic and abused his remaining children. 2 of the boys, including my grandfather, joined the army to escape their home. I believe my grandfather even lied about his age to enlist shortly after his brother did, and they both ended up in Vietnam. My grandfather was a POW and received a Purple Heart. Despite their difficult upbringing and the trauma of war, they turned out to be wonderful men. My favorite great-uncle, Henry, lived in a single-wide trailer by the river. The outside was lined with big chest freezers where he would store the snapping turtles he hunted, filled with water until the turtle man came to buy them. He also filled his bathtub with little turtles, likely to sell to pet stores. He smoked a lot of weed and was the friendliest man I ever knew. Story 16. It was more chilling and saddening than disturbing. I overheard a conversation between my parents when my father decided to stop his cancer treatment and was ready to let go. I I had stopped by their house after work when a nasty storm rolled in, so I stayed the night. My mother, who is quite hearing impaired, speaks loudly, and from the guest bedroom, I heard her say, "There is still something we can do." I went to listen outside their room and realized my father was telling her he was tired of the treatments and just wanted to go. His cognitive decline had already made him feel like he wasn't himself anymore. We all knew this moment would come eventually. He had initially been given a 3-month prognosis, but had fought for over 2 years. You don't really beat stage for brain cancer. I wasn't shocked or disturbed. I just felt an overwhelming sadness. Story 17. One of my friends was killed in action, and a few days later, I overheard a conversation about how his remains were collected. They described it as basically scooping him into a stuffed sack, the kind you use for a sleeping bag, and hosing off what was left. The person sharing this was traumatized by having to reach into that sack to look for his dog tags. The two people talking had no idea that my friend and I had known each other for years. Story 18. I think the worst memory is waking up in the middle of the night when I was 7 and hearing my mom's ex-boyfriend beating her. I remember him telling her to say she just fell down the stairs. Then the ambulance arrived, and when I went downstairs, I saw blood everywhere. She ended up needing staples in her head. Story 19. I've never shared this before, but when I was 17, my mom drove us to the ER because she wasn't feeling well. It turned out she had diabetes, and her blood sugar was dangerously high. After waiting for a bit, she started treatment, but then I suddenly heard beeping and saw people rushing in. Someone pulled me aside and pushed me into a waiting area. But just before I was completely out the door, I heard my mom scream, "I can't breathe, please help me." Those were the last words I heard from her. She passed away the next day. Story 20. When I was a little kid, my mom was at the hairdresser, and the stylist was discussing an 11-year-old girl who had been forced to give birth without any painkillers. She talked about how terrible it was for such a young body to endure that. The thought of an 11-year-old having a baby really disturbed me, and I felt a deep sense of guilt just for hearing about it. Story 21. My babysitter was talking to her husband about how my parents were cheap for taking me out of her care after my little brother was born. I didn't realize at the time that I would be home alone all summer when I was 8, while my infant brother continued to go to the babysitter. It took me a while to piece it all together, but looking back, I can see that my parents were neglectful. Even then, it felt strange to me. Story 22. I overheard someone on a bus mentioning a person who was nearly killed at a Scientology event. They claimed to know about it because they had friends in the legal system involved in a lawsuit stemming from the incident. Apparently, the cult had injured the victim during some kind of test. Story 23. A long time ago, there was a Wailer show in Norfolk, Virginia. That night, I took some shrooms and ended up wandering off instead of watching the performance. I explored all sorts of interesting places, at least they felt interesting at the time, and for some reason, I climbed a tree. It looked like a good one, and I was on drugs. What can I say? So there I was sitting about 15 feet up in this tree, just silent and feeling high. As I was relaxing there, 2 guys walked beneath me, chatting. One of them said to the other, "It gets crazy in there, I know, I stabbed someone." The other guy replied, "Wow." And then the first guy added, "Someone came at me. I had to." Then they walked away. Talk about holding your breath. Story 24. A friend called to cancel our plans because he was sick. He put the phone down, but didn't hang up, and I heard him say, "Okay, out of that. What are we going to do?" Then I heard another voice mention a bar, so I decided to go too. I ended up making the night intentionally awkward. Now, 20 years later, we're still friends and look back on it with a laugh. Story 25. The first and only time my husband and I visited our best friend's ex, we were all in bed, but I was awake. Our good friend and her 6-year-old son were also in the bed with us. I heard her ex in the adjacent living room talking to a buddy, saying he wanted to take her out, followed by, "I would never hurt the kid, just want to get rid of her." I could tell he was serious, so I told her about it the next morning. She's still alive, but I know she changed her habits after that revelation. What an absolute scumbag. Story 26. When my parents' friends came over for dinner, I went to the bathroom. When I returned, they were praising my little sister for overcoming her school phobia and depression. But then they turned their attention to me, expressing disappointment, saying I wasn't doing anything interesting and that I was a bit of a failure. They even commented on my recent weight gain, something I was already aware of but didn't need others to highlight. I was just trying to manage my struggles with depression and binge eating. That conversation really broke something in me. Story 27. My ex thought I was sleeping. She went out onto the back patio, which was right under my open master bedroom window. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I overheard her talking to her friend about how they were both involved with an older man for money and pills. Story 28. I was on a crowded peak hour train in the quiet carriage, where people are expected to keep their music low and phone conversations discreet. A young girl in front of me received a call and began to talk loudly about how her boyfriend gave her herpes, sharing vivid details and theories about his infidelity. Given the quiet atmosphere, she had the undivided attention of over 50 horrified passengers. Story 29. Not long after my mom left, maybe a week or two, I was walking past my dad's bedroom when I overheard him on the phone. He was telling someone that my mom had been having an affair and had left him for that guy. They had told me a different story, of course, but to my 10-year-old self, it broke my heart and made me wonder why we weren't enough for her to want to stay. I brought it up to my dad about 15 years later, and he said, "I'm so sorry. You weren't supposed to know that. I thought you were still downstairs." Story 30. I was at a party when I overheard a girl talking about a guy she had randomly hooked up with. She was telling her friend, nearly in tears, "I almost threw up the next day when I saw him and realized he was Mexican. Then I remembered I forgot to take my pill, and all week I was terrified I was going to have a Mexi baby. Thank God I got my period." I caught her name later on and made sure to remember it. Fast forward about a week, and I was drinking with my buddy Miguel at his place. He mentioned getting laid recently and how he hated himself for not using a condom, saying the girl was pretty unattractive and basically took advantage of him. I blurted out mid-sentence, "Was her name Melissa?" "Yep, it was her." Story 31. At a family reunion, my mother stated she was so happy when I moved out. It was my house, and I was letting her live there for free after her divorce. Story 32. If another nurse had been taking care of him, he'd be alive right now. I spent the entire night running around trying to stabilize a patient while my difficult co-workers sat nearby, loudly criticizing me and talking about how incompetent I was. Neither of them lifted a finger to help. When the patient crashed, both of them suddenly disappeared, and it was nurses from the other side of the hallway who rushed in to assist with the code. After everything was over, I overheard one of them make that remark. They even told the unit manager that I was incompetent and crying at the bedside. Thankfully, neither of them works on the unit anymore. Bad nurses can really undermine a unit. The culture in a hospital is crucial, and teamwork is essential. I absolutely can't stand bad nurses. Story 33. When I was 7, I was living in a trailer and struggling financially, but I asked my friend if I could spend the night. He called his mom to ask, and I overheard her say, "Tell him no, I don't want roaches and lice." That really hit me hard. To this day, I have intense anxiety about keeping my house clean. I couldn't help being poor, and the roaches didn't pay rent. Story 34. My stepmom once told my grandma that I was useless, heartless, abusive, and a leech when I couldn't buy my dad a birthday gift. Instead, I painted something for him since I was only 16 and had no money. My mom wouldn't buy anything for her ex-husband, and my stepmom never made an effort to get to know me. Hearing her say that was really heartbreaking, especially since our meant a lot to me at that age. It's changed the way I see her as a person. Story 35. During my first internship, I overheard one of my supervisors questioning the others about whether I was genuinely mentally handicapped. That really hurt. Edit, she definitely meant it in a derogatory way. Not only did she insult me, but she also criticized the undergrad program I came from for sending her someone she deemed incompetent. Nothing I did warranted her behavior. For instance, she would ask for my opinion and then laugh at me when I shared it. She'd direct me to one room for a meeting, only to snap at me for not being in the right place. That was 10 years ago, and now I have several degrees and am happily employed in the same field at a company that truly values me. Story 36. I once overheard my friend's mom telling her son, who was my canoeing partner, that my complaints about leg pain were just because I was being wimpy and overly dramatic. A few weeks later, I discovered I had a bone tumor in my leg. It was tough to hear that, but I guess it made sense since I was dealing with cancer. The good news is, everything's fine now. Story 37. I called my friend to see if he wanted to hang out when I was about 10. He said he needed to check with his mom first. I overheard him say, "Lazarus 870 wants to do something, but I don't want to see him." I guess he thought he had muted the phone or didn't muffle his voice very well. When he came back, he said, "Sorry, my mom said I can't." Looking back, he wasn't a great friend over the years. Story 38. A few years ago, my sister's phone was acting up and would randomly call people. One time it called me, and after I stopped singing and messing around trying to get her attention, I decided to just listen. I heard her complaining about me to her mother-in-law. I can't recall the specifics, but the fact that she was venting to someone who barely knows me really struck me. If it had been one of our other siblings, who I'm close with, it wouldn't have bothered me as much. So I promptly called her back and chewed her a new a-hole. Story 39. I had just moved into my dorm for my second year of college, sharing a space with my best friend since 9th grade. My stuff hadn't arrived yet, and I needed to register, so I asked if I could use his computer. He said yes. When I sat down, I noticed he had AM open to a conversation with another friend. I didn't scroll up, but from what I could see, they were were discussing how strange I was and how difficult it would be to room with me. I quickly closed the chat, hoping he wouldn't realize I had seen it, registered, and then left. We continued living together that year, but we barely interacted. We just shared the space without any real connection. I never asked him to hang out, and he never did either. Move-out day was the last time we spoke, over 10 years ago. We had chatted every day for 6 years before that, but after that, there was silence. I still wonder if I did something to change how he felt about me, or if he never really liked me at all. The thought of the latter complicates future friendships, and so does the former, knowing I could have unknowingly ruined a 5-year friendship. Story 40. My mother told a relative that I was useless, selfish, arrogant, ornery, and stupid for giving up on my education. I was just 16, having recently transferred from a private college prep school 7 miles away to a public school only a mile from home. I walked and took public buses to both schools. I was my mom's caregiver, housekeeper, bill payer, shopper, gardener, handyman, security, and courier, all day, every day. I had no social life and worked part-time. For 3 years, I had been managing all of this on my own, despite being the youngest of 7 siblings. Hearing her words hit me hard. I felt like I had been sucker punched. There I was in my apron and rubber gloves, holding a laundry basket, and I broke down in tears. It wasn't just the hurtful things she said, it was the fact that she was lying to make me look bad in front of others, ensuring that if I ever reached out for help, I wouldn't get any. That day taught me a tough lesson about trust and family. Story 41. I was in the ER, critically ill and septic, with tubes connected to me and 4 antibiotics running. I didn't know if I'd make it through the night. Meanwhile, my family was at home, and my niece called them, putting them on speaker. I overheard my mother saying she didn't care about me, that she never had. She was only there to make sure my nephew was okay. She claimed I got dirty diseases from being gay and sleeping around. It wasn't an STD, and I didn't contract it from promiscuity. Since that day, I haven't reached out to her. Even worse, I was close to the nephew she was raising, and she didn't even tell him I was dying. He found out from a Facebook post about me being in the hospital and was shocked. He wanted to visit, but she told him no. When he showed up at the hospital anyway, she disowned him and kicked him out. There was no conflict between us. She has narcissistic personality disorder, and my illness distracted attention from her. In her mind, I needed to be put in my place. The same thing happened when my dad died. She got angry at us for grieving, as if our sadness personally offended her. She started acting that way the very next day. She really is the worst. Story 42. This is my best friend's story, not mine, but I think it's worth sharing. Let's call her Carrie. She was born extremely prematurely, but ended up perfectly healthy. People would never guess unless they saw photos from when she was born. When she was around 8, she was at the top of the stairs, peeking through the banister, secretly listening to her parents argue downstairs. Her mom said, "Well, why aren't you that hard on Carrie? She doesn't get straight A's either." To which her dad replied, "Carrie was born premature. She's probably retarded." Story 43. I went out to a bar with some friends for a birthday party for my ex-girlfriend. She really hurt me when she left, but I wanted to be nice since she invited me, so I decided to go for a drink or two. While I was there, I chatted with a mutual friend who had just gone through a breakup a few days earlier. I did my best to reassure her, knowing how tough breakups can be. I was experiencing one myself. After I stepped away from the table, I overheard her talking to my ex at the bar. She said, "Well, nobody has ever loved him, so what does he know about any of this?" They both started laughing. I don't think they realized I was listening, but I grabbed my coat and took a long walk home. I don't need people like that in my life, and I haven't seen either of them since. Story 44. My wife had a falling out with some friends of mine that she met through me. While I had known them for a long time, she was relatively new to the group. I was frustrated one night because they kept asking why she never came around anymore, but she wouldn't budge on seeing them. I thought it had something to do with a small business venture they tried together that didn't work out. As I was driving her somewhere, I finally expressed my frustration about her not wanting to reconcile with them and how much it bothered me that she never joined me when I visited. That's when she finally opened up and told me the truth. It turned out that every time she went over there without me, they would talk negatively about me, mocking my personality and sense of humor. They seemed to think it was all in good fun, like a casual joke, but she wasn't okay with it at all. She's not one to confront people, so she never said anything, but she was really disgusted by how they spoke about me behind my back. She had let me believe it was all her fault, thinking it would spare my feelings. And honestly, it hurt to hear the truth. Story 45. I'm 12 years younger than my sisters and was an unplanned child. When I was 7, I overheard my mom crying on Christmas Eve, telling her best friend that I was the reason she didn't love my dad anymore, that we were poor, and that she wasn't happy. She said she didn't know how to love someone who had ruined her entire life. It shattered my heart and spirit, and that was just the start of a difficult childhood. Now at 29, I moved out at 15 to protect myself and haven't spoken to my parents since. I know it wasn't my fault that I was born, but that memory still haunts me. Story 46. My boss openly mocked me in front of my entire team. To be fair, I was frustrated, but it was justified. The product I was working on wasn't functioning correctly, and I was falling behind. When I raised my concerns about production potentially contaminating my work, he dismissed me, saying the issue was my lack of speed. Feeling overwhelmed and under pressure, I snapped, with tears in my eyes, "Okay, fine, I guess this is just how we do business now. I'll push it through." About an hour later, I overheard him behind the hoods, using a high-pitched, mocking tone to mimic me. He repeated my words in a way that made me look incompetent to the rest of the team, which was particularly hurtful since I'm the only woman on the team. The worst part? There was indeed a significant problem with production, and he ended up taking credit for discovering it. My colleagues no longer respect me. They talk down to me now. It's disheartening to think that one emotional outburst could alter everyone's perception of me so drastically. I'm seriously considering looking for a new job, even if it means accepting a lower salary, just to escape this emotional female label that now follows me. Story 47. I've always dealt with social anxiety, but I finally felt like I was making progress. On my way to meet a group of friends, I texted one of the girls about our plans. Just before I knocked on her door, I overheard her say, "Oh my God, she's so annoying. Why can't she just get the hint?" It turned into a few minutes of them trash-talking me, despite their claims that they'd never judge me and that we were like family. All the progress I had made with my anxiety came crashing down. Later, when she tried to invite me to her wedding, I took satisfaction in not responding to her messages. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.